to welcome everyone to our inaugural industry panel event. So we're super excited to bring this event to you and deliver on our vision of uniting students, academia and industry in the field of behavioural economics. So today we have the privilege of hosting two industry leaders for a conversation to speak about their careers, the work that they do, and in their words, what the field of behaviour looks like going into the future. So we're so excited for you guys to be here with us on Zoom, and without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists. So our first panelist is Jason Collins, who has had an interesting path to where he is now, which we'll get more into depth soon. So Jason is currently the Director of Behavioural Economics at PwC and runs the Sydney Behavioural Economics and Science Meetups, and is a founding columnist at the Behavioural Scientist. He also holds a PhD in economics and evolutionary biology. Welcome, Jason, and thank you so much for being here. Now I want to introduce Dr. Kim Louw. So Kim currently oversees a team of 2 staff applying behavioural insights across a range of policy areas and to trial design and data analytics at the New South Wales Behavioural Insights Unit. Kim leads the team's work to achieve gender equality in senior roles in the New South Wales government in line with the Premier's world-class public service priority. Before joining the New South Wales Behavioural Insights Unit, Kim worked in policy and consulting roles in Western Australia, and perhaps relevant to many in the audience, maybe applying for grad jobs. She started as a graduate policy officer at the Department of Premier and Cabinet at Western Australia. And Kim holds a PhD and master's degree in the area of applied psychology. Thank you and welcome, Kim. Thank you so much for being here today. So we'll move on to our first section, covering how both panelists found themselves in the field of behavioural economics. Now I can imagine, especially students attending a behavioural economics event at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday night, many may be aware of the prominent work of the likes of Fowler and Kahneman. And over the past 10 years, building on from their work, there have been behavioural insights hubs being set up around the world at both state and federal levels of the government, and now as we see in corporations such as PwC and CBA. However, something that I've come to realise is that despite the growing prominence and relevance of this field, there isn't really a clear path as to how to build a career in behavioural economics. Now to set the scene, I wanted to ask you first, Jason. So you've had an interesting lead up to your current role at PwC. So you transitioned from being a lawyer to a campaigner with Greenpeace, to getting your PhD in economics and also leading the data science team at ASIC. Can you tell us more about your journey and how you established your career in behavioural economics?
Right, unmuted, yes. I took a pretty circuitous route. Yeah, well, in fact, my whole career has been a bit of a snaking journey, and because I actually started off as a lawyer. I did law as my undergrad, and very quickly realised that law wasn't what I was interested in. I was far more interested in why laws are the way they are, rather than I guess their application. And at the time, I was also trying to get a bit of yin yang from the I suppose the world of law, and was doing some volunteering for Greenpeace, and that ultimately turned into some several years of campaigning with them. But ultimately, I decided that the answer to that why as opposed to the what was in economics. And so I worked in Treasury in Canberra for a bit, and then moved to PwC in their Perth office, basically working as a standard economist. I did a grad dip and a master's of economics. And that was in some ways the into my current role. But it didn't take me too long to suddenly realise that even economics fell a little bit short of what I was looking for and what I wanted to know. And quickly realised that a lot of the foundations probably weren't as solid as people thought. And you can just read now decades of research by, as you mentioned, Kahneman, Thaler and others as to why those foundations may not be so strong. So the way I tackled it though was actually started to do a PhD sort of on the side while I was working, and combined evolutionary biology with economics. And so that's, for me, the real foundations of human decision making. And it was through that I got across the breadth of the behavioural science, behavioural economics literature. And it was actually while I was doing that I was introduced to who's now a very good friend of mine within PwC, who had just returned from the UK, who'd done a Masters of Behavioural Economics at University of Nottingham, Will Mailer. And this is back in about 2014, and we both just suddenly went, hang on, PwC doesn't have a behavioural economics practice. Why don't we do something And so over the sort of, I guess, the following year or so, we started, in our evenings and weekends, we started drafting up case studies, ideas for products that we could sell into the market, and slowly started doing that. And we actually got a lot of traction. So we both managed to, sell to quite a few clients. And also internally, we won an internal firm competition called the Global Innovation Challenge, which gave us a lot of, I suppose, internal profile. And so that's now the practice that I lead. Will's gone off to Commonwealth Bank, where he actually leads their behavioural economics practice there. So really, the way I got into working in behavioural economics was sort of, I suppose, seeing a gap in PwC. Like, it's a great big firm. There's, I think, 9,000 employees in Australia now, a few thousand in consulting. And it was just realising, hang on, there's something that could be of real value to clients here. And we went out and made something of value and sold it.
Okay, really interesting. I also wanted to ask, talking about, the internal innovation competition that you and Will ended up, I guess, winning, and, perhaps that was the thing that kind of brought behavioural economics to PwC. What was the essence of what you guys were trying to sell at that time? Like, what was it that convinced people at PwC at the time, okay, maybe this is something that is worth, taking on? Like, what was your project at the time?
Well, in some ways, so it was actually, in some ways, what it was a competition where the PwC network of global firms, anyone could throw in an idea. And typically the competition was dominated, and still is, like, it's an annual competition, and it's still dominated by technology ideas, so apps and the like. But so we went in there with quite a different idea. It was just simply the idea that for all these apps and technology and different ways that you're designing, ultimately you've got to design them for humans. And that's what we call our product, designing for humans. So at some point, nearly every, particularly in the technology space, every app has to interface with a human decision maker. Someone's going to interact with, make decisions, say purchase a product, hand over their details to the Australian government, whatever it might be. And it's only by designing it with that human user in mind and what their decision-making apparatus is that you can actually have a successful technological solution. And that was really the heart of what we pitched. And so at the time, we talked a lot about, there's a lot of major sort of, I guess, global problems where behaviour is at the heart of it, everything from climate change to, a lot of, I suppose, health is actually based around behaviours, as we're learning every day now. So it was going, how can we really turn this new science that was sort of starting to get industry application, how can we really turn it onto those problems?
Yeah, and definitely really resonate with you as well, and being curious as to the why, like behind the way that things are, as opposed to the what. So yeah, pretty cool insights there. And thank you for sharing, Jason. We also wanted to ask Kim. So now, Kim, so you've had a more of a conventional path, I guess, starting as a graduate course at the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Western Australia in 2015, and leading to your current role as Principal Behavioural Insights Advisor with the New South Wales Behavioural Insights Unit. Can you tell us more about your transition from university, starting as a grad, and to now building your career and working in behavioural insights/economics?
Thanks. I actually did think that mine was not, I thought mine was kind of circuitous too, Jason, but after hearing yours, I guess mine is a bit more of a straight line. So as Michelle said, I did a PhD and a master's in organisational psychology, or applied psychology as you might know it. So a little bit different route in terms of, coming to the field from that side, although I'd say that is relatively common. So I was gung-ho on the idea that I was going to be a clinical psychologist, actually. So I was going to treat patients. I thought that was my calling. I really loved that. And then I took a year off between my honours and my master's, and I did a bunch of counselling and suicide prevention and a bunch of other things. And I quickly realised that while I was really passionate about it, I didn't think it was something that would necessarily be the best choice for me as a long-term career. And I started to get quite passionate about psychology of work, and specifically, given that we spend most of our time at work, how do we improve that for people and make sure we get really good outcomes? So I started a master's in applied psychology, and then went on to do my PhD. again, similar to the previous story, I was pretty sure that I wanted to be an academic, that I wanted to publish papers and work at a university and all of those things. But as I got closer and closer to that deadline of finishing my PhD, I realised that I was coming home and I was often crying at the end of a day of a PhD, and finding it quite stressful. So I thought my partner at the time, my partner now, said to me, actually, why don't you think about something else? And it's a pretty big commitment to be an academic. I encourage those who are interested in doing it to do it, but certainly for me, it's a pretty big commitment. So I decided to go into a grad program, and I specifically chose a grad program, even though I might have been able to get another kind of job. But I thought a grad program would give me the best chance of seeing anything that I could be interested in. So I think that they're good because they often allow you to do a lot of rotations in a lot of areas. And again, I chose the Department of Premier and Cabinet. It's a central government agency, sort of gets to be involved in a lot of coordination of different types of government policy. So I thought that again would be the best chance for me to find something I loved. During that time, I kind of was aware of behavioural insights units starting up in different organisations. Obviously, the sort of first primary kind of one was in 2010, the UK Behavioural Insights team that's now gone on to be a sort of not-for-profit government, for a corporate entity now. But at the time they were working in the Cabinet Office. And so I was kind of aware of this kind of work, and it was out there. And through a weird set of circumstances, I was sent an email about job openings in this new team in New South Wales. They were going from having 3 people to a big team of 12 or 14. And I was sent this email, and I decided to apply from Perth. So maybe Jason and I are telling you to go to Perth. But certainly I saw that job and I applied for a position there. I actually started off as a behavioural advisor, which is sort of just above our entry level position there. And then over the last 5 years have now gone on to lead a small team within that team.
Awesome. Okay, thanks so much for that, Kim. So you mentioned, so like during your time as a grad, so you did rotate through, so did you rotate through the areas of behavioural impact before you made that transition, or was it like something that you heard about and then when you saw that job application, you made the application, then you moved to New South Wales? Is that kind of how it happened?
Yeah, look, at the time there was really, there wasn't too many central government teams. The big team in the Commonwealth government didn't exist. The team in Victoria didn't exist. And it certainly didn't exist in Western Australia as a kind of formalised team. To some extent, it's kind of a fallacy to say that these sorts of things didn't exist entirely before. There were elements of people trying to drive behaviour change. But I guess the idea of it being a sort of specific behavioural insights team, there weren't these formalised teams. So no, I didn't do any kind of work in that space. I was mostly working on cabinet and budget estimates and intergovernmental relations, so I got to look at lots of COAG papers and things like that. I think it was fantastic for me though in terms of my career. There was a bunch of how to get things done in government that I learnt in that time. I was only really there for 7 months, so I didn't complete my grad program, but it certainly was really helpful. I do think it's sometimes a trap that people fall into in terms of thinking that your career has always got to be linear, that you've got to move from sort of, one job to get a promotion to the next job and to those things. And I think both Jason and I have kind of had different times where we've taken different career choices to sort of figure out what works best for us. So I'd really, I think that was probably something as well that I was glad that I did.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating to hear about your experience and Jason's as well, like a very non-linear path to where you guys have arrived to now. So it's comforting to know that. And thank you for sharing your experiences about, I guess, your journey to where you are now, Kim. So I guess we'll move on to the second section now, and we'll try to get an insight into the kind of work that our panelists do. So for the first question, I'm going to ask Jason. Jason, so you made a post on your blog recently, jasoncollins.blog, for anyone who's interested, which I'll quote now. So as behavioural scientists, we're not exactly a diverse bunch, We're university educated, we live in major cities. We work in academia, tech, consulting, banking, and finance. In that light, we need to think more broadly about the questions we tackle and the answers that we like. We need to ask what problems matter to the large swathes of the population that we don't encounter in our day-to-day. So could you talk a bit more about that, and especially in the context of your work at PwC, Jason?
Sure, yeah. And so I should say, so that particular piece that I quoted there was sort of in effectively behavioural scientists looking for commentary around the future of behavioural science. So what do we really need to be thinking about, what are our hopes and dreams and warnings and so on over the next 10 years. And the reason I wrote that particular piece is I think just if you find this in any area where people tend to self-select into it. And so in the world of behavioural science, so we're largely psycholigists or economists of certain persuasions who perhaps aren't convinced by the typical economics and the like. We're a fairly liberal bunch, and by that I mean in the small L. And you read a lot of the work we do, and I don't want to belittle it. It's important work, but we do an awful lot of work around diversity and environmental issues and the sorts of things which I think I in that piece sort of said it's full of stuff that you hear on a Democrat stump speech or the like, and there's just I think a broader suite of applications that we could be really tackling there, and it's like in some ways I think I don't want to accuse the sort of the whole field of just having a left bias about some doing that, but really sort of saying, look, there's other issues which we could really be tackling with a lot more zest, and perhaps that we're leaving behind. And perhaps one, a really interesting one right now is in the world of the pandemic. We spent an awful lot of time focusing on, over the last 5-10 years, so much effort on preventative health. So getting smoking, obesity, again, the sorts of things where you can really do some some quite important, quite useful things to change behaviour. When perhaps if we had focused on different questions such as decision making in healthcare, how do you actually design systems that can work from a decision making perspective in a pandemic? Those sort of issues. It's kind of perhaps obviously I've got the benefit of hindsight throwing that up now, but I think that's the sort of area there tends to be a fairly narrow set of problems that we're tackling, and they're not perhaps the most important for some of the future problems that we're going to be facing.
Okay. And okay.
Slightly circuitous answer there.
No, but really good insight there. So like you mentioned, you see perhaps, it might be more useful to apply insights from behavioral economics to actually design like structures of society, as opposed to, I guess, the way that it's kind of like run now to change individual to change a behavior on an individual level. So do you feel that behavioral insights can be used to tackle something at such a large scale? So like, say, for example, like designing, I guess, a different way for people to actually make decisions on like a more macro scale. Do you think behavioral insights can do that?
Absolutely. To give two examples, one short and then one a bit from my day-to-day work. So think about tax policies. So the very earliest sort of public successes of the behavioural insights team when it came out of the UK was around getting people to be more likely to submit their tax return on time. So send a letter, include a social norm, simplify it, sort of things like that, and you can get better response rate. And yet the actual structure of our tax system, so how do you actually design a tax system that's easy to comply with, that generates the right behaviours from its citizens? That's, behavioural science isn't the only tool, but behavioural science has so much to say about that. And in a similar vein, so in my day-to-day work now, I always get asked things such as we've got this financial product and customers are doing X and we want them to do Y. And so they go, can you come up with some text messages, some letters to send to these customers that will change behaviour? And yes, and the answer is yes, I'd love to. I'm more than happy to. But why is the product designed that way? Why are you providing, why is your suite of savings products and credit products, why does it look like that? And can you actually, instead of playing around with the communications at the tail end, can you go further upstream and actually design financial, in that case, the suite of financial products that you offer your customers, so that the customers ultimately, don't have to be prompted into the right decisions. Instead, those products are designed to automatically work in their hands, so they don't like when someone is inattentive or has low self-control or the like, or has an emotional response to market movements, whatever it might be. Instead, we've gone right back to the beginning and thought about it rather than sort of trying to patchwork over at the end through communications. Because in the end, behavioural science, quite often more behavioural insights, sort of gets framed as all the great examples are comms, but I think as comms is often a band-aid on a bigger issue.
Okay. Yeah, really interesting what you said there. Instead of trying to kind of deal with the tail end of communications, instead trying to get to the way that how the suite of products are actually designed in the first place. But I think it's interesting coming from your perspective, in a kind of corporate entity in which you work for. I just find it, it would be interesting to kind of hear what the people think about changing these actual products to make it better for customers to use. Is that something that is in line with their other priority to maximize profit? So I just feel like
yes, there's definitely a conflict, and it's always tough giving people advice that costs them money. But part of the reason why I'm doing so much work in financial services right now is we've just had a Royal Commission. The banks, in fact, insurers, wealth providers, they've all been dragged through the mud, and they've all realised that there is actually a responsibility they have. I think that a lot of the leadership has really picked up on that, and so you're seeing quite regularly now some of these organisations are leaving a lot of money on the table because I think it's the right thing to do. And to just use a public example, and although this is a downstream example, so Commonwealth Bank have been increasing and really working on their communications around how they communicate with people around their credit card payments and making sure people don't pay late and they pay on time. And that's cost them tens of millions of dollars in late payment fees that they haven't otherwise received.
Interesting.
But the right thing to do.
Yeah, hopefully more more people in those leadership and executive positions, kind of take that on here going forward as well. Thank you for that, Jason. Okay, and so now we'll move to Kim and speak a bit about her work, in the New South Wales Behavioural Insights unit. So Kim, your recent work has involved, working to achieve gender equality within the New South Wales government. Could you perhaps talk a bit more about that project and what methods and strategies you have employed to achieve this goal?
Sure. I guess kind of reiterating some of Jason's, I agree with Jason's point around, I think there's more we can do. And I think sometimes just looking at the kind of individual behaviours is not enough. I think there's more we can do, but individual behaviours do add up very quickly. So I think, there is examples of how we can use that in broader ways. So yes, just reiterating that point. In terms of the gender equality piece that we did, so the Premier has a set of now 14 priorities. They're whole of government priorities that they're designed to keep government accountable for delivering on certain things. One of them is around delivering a world-class public service, and a component of that is to see gender equality at senior roles. So specifically, it's to have a 50% representation of women in senior leader roles in the public service by 2025. So we've got 5 years to go. And when we started this project, we were sitting at around about a third. But when you look at the New South Wales public service as a whole, or government sector as a whole, it's about 66% women. So when you are sort of transitioning from the more junior roles up into the senior roles, we lose that proportion of women, and it's around about a third represented in senior roles. So our work in this, we have a 3-step methodology in our team, which is called Understand, Build and Test. We spend the first part of our project really trying to understand what the behavioural barriers and drivers of a particular behaviour is in the New South Wales context. And that's really important because things that work in some areas don't always work in others. And I think that's part of us kind of trying to keep some humility around what we do. Behavioural economics and behavioural insights is a growing field, and we, if there's one kind of thing that we know about it, is that context is key. And so in different contexts, we'll see different behaviours and different interventions will work. So it's kind of the first thing. And I'll just tell you just some of the things that we did so you can get a sense of what our role looks like. We were able to look to pull data from 5 years worth of people applying to the government. It's all de-identified and those sorts of things, and we, you know, maintain privacy, but we were able to look at that sort of 5 years worth of data. That was over 1.1 million applications to the government over that time, and we could look at trends of who was applying and who, you know, who wasn't, how frequently were they applying, and look at differences between men and women. We also went out and interviewed people for an hour, so 65 men and women across the public service in senior roles. So you can probably see some quantitative and now qualitative skills kind of coming into the role. And then we sent surveys out to around about we sent it out to about 5,000 people, and had about 2,500 people respond to surveys on why they did and didn't apply to the government. And finally, we work really closely with academics. So we have a nice relationship with the Harvard Kennedy Women in Public Policy team there. So we've been kind of working with them. So that was just the first part of this project, and we used all of those insights to figure out where in the pipeline, in that employee life cycle, from people applying to roles, being selected, to being promoted, to staying in the job, where were we losing women? And what we found was that actually when women applied, they were more likely to be hired, which is surprising. This is certainly at an aggregate level. But what we found was that was true at senior levels. But what we found was that women were less likely to apply, and we could see that there were pretty significant differences in women's likelihood to come back to reapply for a role after they had just missed out. So I guess kind of thinking about this, there's a number of different reasons why that can be. There's, you know, sociocultural reasons, there's other, you know, life stage reasons, things like that. But obviously we need to make sure that we design our systems for equality. So we then worked with our project partners, and I think a kind of key part of my role is working across government. So in this instance, we had 5 different departments working with us. We worked on 2 different interventions. One was just a simple email, and one was a phone call. And the idea of these was to really focus on encouragement. It went out to both men and women, and these were trying to address this gap that we noticed in our research in the start, where we found that women were often, you know, quite discouraged from not getting a job, and often thought that they, instead of interpreting it as they didn't get it for this particular time, but they, you know, had the skills and ability to do the role, they actually interpreted it quite internally and thought that if they didn't get the role, it meant they were less likely to be able to do that role. And so we designed it purely on encouragement, both the email and the phone call. And what we were able to find that when we combined those 2 interventions together, we were able to take the gender gap in reapplication from 45%. So men were 45% more likely to reapply to another senior role in a 6-month period in comparison to women. We were able to take that gender gap down to 4%. Now that became from a significant difference between men and women to a non-significant difference between men and women. So it's pretty impressive result. And I guess the other cool part about this is that something that we can now roll out and is in the process of implementing across the sector. So I guess you can see how your ideas and your interventions can be tested rigorously so, and making sure that doesn't lead to worse outcomes for anybody, but can also then you know, you can see it rolling out in making a real world difference.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that, Kim. And yeah, pretty amazing result that you were able to achieve, like in terms of bringing the statistic from 45 to 4%. It's pretty interesting there. I guess like a question that I wanted to open up to the both of you. Yeah, what has been like a career highlight for you, you know, so far in the context of applying behavioural insights to generate an outcome that you've been really excited about? So yeah, Jason or Kim.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just go to the first. Like for me, the first one was probably the most exciting, and this one was actually working with a combination. It was actually with the Department of Premier and Cabinet, the Behavioural Insights Unit, and the Behavioural Insights team who were actually in there at the time helping set that up. And we played a role in it largely around the field trial, but the topic was around return to work outcomes. So when you have someone who is injured in the workplace and then they receive workers' compensation, And the question was, can you get people to return to work faster? And so we provide, like, the expertise we largely injected into that particular project was around the interpretation of the data, that helping out with the field trial, because as with, you always hear stories about lovely randomised control trials, but the reality is it's never quite like that. So we spent a lot of helped out the department with trying to work out, basically, did these interventions help? And that basically, I suppose the shift is that someone who was received the various, the treatments around sort of, supporting their commitments and, some of the communications changes to them, they were 20% more likely to be back up to work after 90 days than someone who was in the other group. And anyway, that particular project, we then took that same work to about another half dozen organisations, Australia and internationally, where we've done basically the same piece to accelerate people getting back into the workplace faster. But it was kind of like that very first one was just the real eye opener to me, because like I knew the power of behavioural science. We were there going, we're going to get a new thing, we're going to get something really happening within PwC, but seeing it on something like that, where if you had asked me beforehand, could you really get someone to work back faster? They're injured. Like, how can you really shift them? And you actually can, because there's more than their injury that's leading them to come back to work. It's around expectations and the like, and also just the way that their injury improves. There's a big behavioural element to that, as to what they do to help themselves get better. So it sort of showed to me that the areas where you might look at it and go, not much here, but no, there actually was.
Okay, and what were the nature of these interventions, Jason? So like that led to the successful.
So there was quite a few of them. Probably the one, I suppose that probably one of the biggest was really around the commitments from those who were injured. So one of the big issues that you find in a lot of behavioural science is really what you call sort of an intention action gap, where even if people like might say, I want to get better, I want to go back to work, but what is the actual action they're going to take, and are they really going to do it? And through having the claims officers and others who are dealing with them sort of actually get commitments from them around, I'm going to go for a walk tomorrow, and actually sort of plan around that. That's typically, but the sort of thing where you start to, people can really do it. It's like, it comes from sort of, the idea for that comes from classic experiments where you ask someone about, are you going to get a flu shot? And if they go, yes, they're far less likely to go, well, tell us about the plan to get the flu shot. I'm going to catch the bus and go, and you write it down, and they're more likely to do it. And so the concept comes from that, but it's a very similar idea here, by getting people to actually engage in just a mental exercise where they do some planning. They're more likely to do it. I should also say, it's like the one piece, and we found this particularly in the later work I did, is, and this is just again, particularly in government space, but both government and private sector, is we're just horrible communicators. It's just, people are just sent confusing, turgid stuff, and you don't need to be a behavioural scientist to fix it. But being from the behavioural science teams gives you the license to fix something that should have been fixed a long time ago, and just so often just writing it in a way that a human can understand just yields so much benefit. I keep thinking that one day we'll be out of a job because someone will go, oh, you need some English writers to get a lot of this benefit, which is true. But I think having the credentials just lets you do stuff that people haven't previously been able to get over the line.
Okay, yeah, super interesting. Thank you for that, Jason. So I'm mindful of the time, so we have 3 minutes until we hit our question and answer time. So I think I'll squeeze in one question from myself. Maybe we'll try to keep 3 minutes, and I guess Jason and Kim, as both leaders in your respective fields, how do you see the field of behavioural economics looking like in the next 10 years? I guess I'll get the answer from both of you, if that's okay.
Sure. Jason, do you want to go first?
After you.
Okay, Sean. All right. Look, so from the government perspective, I actually think government has been a pretty big innovator in this space for a while now. And so we've been doing a lot of work quite early on. Where I think we have left some cards on the table, first of all, broad scale implementation of behavioural insights across the sector. So there are patches where it's taken up really well and there's patches where it's not. And as Jason said, I think there's a lot of low hanging fruit still left in government to sort out. We're particularly bad at designing policies, or governments around the world can be particularly bad around designing policies and services that meet the needs of government and don't meet the needs of customers. It's actually one of the reasons I'm really department set up around customer service that was started last year, which is really world leading in that sense. So I'm pretty excited about that component, but I also think the interaction between data analytics, machine learning, and behavioural insights, which is kind of, a cliched answer in this space, but I think that's somewhere we can be a bit better on and somewhere where I think we're going. And finally, I think, so I guess my answer is broad scale implementation across, and also these more targeted and more data analytics side of behavioural insights. That's it. You go, Jason. You got 1 minute.
Cool. Well, I guess this is kind of a hope. I don't know, hope as opposed to a vision maybe, but I just want a lot more good competitors. Because right now I go into most clients and I have to explain what I do. I have to explain what the benefits to them might be. And I'd much rather go in there and then go, wow, this was EY did some behavioural science work for it. It was awesome. Or yeah, Deloitte did this behavioural science project here and we got great results. And it'll just make my life much easier. We'll grow the market, and then when it comes down to better products, better policy, whatever it might be, it'll be great because right now there's just not enough. I think people in this space delivering really high quality services, and I want to see more of it. It doesn't have to be me, but others out there doing it would be fantastic.
Well, hopefully, with the kind of growing, group at UTS, enthusiastic about behavioural economics, maybe we can be part of that future. Jason, I'm curious, why do you feel like there hasn't been as much uptake by the other, I guess, big competitors? Because you see PwC and CBA, but why haven't Deloitte and EY?
So two reasons. The main one is just a talent reason. So in Australia, it hasn't really had any sort of, I guess, clear coursework-based science courses out there. So QUT started a grad cert last year, and now UTS has a grad cert as of this year, which is great. And so it's just starting to create a domestic pipeline. So up until now, if you wanted someone who's had done deep training, you're looking for a PhD all the time, or to someone who has an amazing level of willingness to self-educate. So a lot of the recruitment that's happened in the space has, particularly in the private sector, we're looking internationally, and that's where we're finding the talent. So I think once there's a small local talent, that will help. The other part is because I think there's quite a lot of people out there who brand themselves behavioural insights, behavioural science, probably are closer to customer experience or comms people. And it just delivers a slightly underwhelming picture of what's possible. And so I think it's going to be one of those things where once there's more people out here showing what's good, it'll increase the market, and suddenly those like Deloitte's, the EYs will suddenly go, hang on, there's this big market here we need to be a part of, and we'll probably see them in there.
Yeah.
And I think demand is growing, right, Jason? Because I think, certainly when I joined the team in 2015, I spent most of my time doing the exact conversation that you just mentioned. So explaining what behavioural insights is, what we could do to help, all of those aspects. And it was always essentially a sort of sales type situation, although obviously we're an easy sell because we're free to government. But I certainly that was part of it. I think that has, certainly in the last 2 to 3 years, that has really shifted for our team. We have to have a really strict criteria on how we select projects to move forward, partly because we have more projects coming in and more requests for our services than we can deliver in terms of our capacity. So we're now limited in terms of capacity. So I think that the demand is also growing, which I think we'll see some of the competition increase as well.
Okay, thanks so much, guys. Yeah, a lot to think about, especially for the budding, behavioural economics enthusiasts here. So guys, I guess, yeah, I'll now bring it to, you guys. If you guys have any questions or anything that you guys would like to ask to Jason and Kim.
About while we're looking for hands, I can answer the last question on the chat about behavioural economics and behavioural science very quickly.
Okay. Yeah.
So, because behavioural economics is a fairly narrow field. I label myself as a behavioural economist because I sit in the economics and policy team, and it's what people know. But what I really do is behavioural science, because I draw on such a much broader field. So behavioural science includes, cognitive psychology, social psychology, could draw on anthropology, sociology. Like, it's really
neuroscience,
a much broader field. Neuroscience indeed. So when I sort of say I do behavioural science, but I advertise myself as behavioural economics.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I did know that because, so I'm not a registered psychologist, so I can't actually say that I'm a psychologist, but but I would say the same thing. And I think just to add an additional term, behavioural insights is kind of the capture all from my perspective. But I think probably where I would say behavioural insights combines something else is it kind of combines or uses behavioural science and combines that with robust methodologies, evaluation methodologies often, where I think, which I think is a kind of key value add of using behavioural insights. People sometimes don't necessarily think of behavioural insights as using that testing component, though. That's a sort of depends a bit what team you come from.
Yeah, indeed. Although I should say that's actually the piece which I always say to our clients: unless you're actually doing the testing, it's not behavioural science. It's just storytelling, and it drives me nuts when a client doesn't want to test.
I'm with you.
So yeah, I think I'll give it over to Sanaz, who I know has been monitoring our questions. So Sanaz, if you wanted to take the floor and get asking any questions we have.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just run through the other three that were in the chat. So Eleanor asked, how can behavioural insights be used to influence governments instead of a top-down approach?
I mean, I guess difficult for me to answer that one because I work within government. So I guess I'm rarely in the position of influencing governments from the outside. So, but I mean, there's a whole literature on some of these things. There's a Behavioural Insights team paper on behavioural government, which you could look up after this. But essentially, I mean, behavioural insights, applying it to decision making within government is hugely important. I think Jason's perspective around, the current pandemic situation that we're in is a classic example where we have, it's a pretty high likelihood that we would experience a pandemic, but no one knows when. And so we discount the likelihood of that happening at some point in the future and focus on our problem right now, which, various other things are more pressing in the time. So I think there's definitely ways that we can apply behavioural insights to the way government thinks about things and makes decisions. It's a difficult thing because I work in government, so I know that I'm also subject to all the biases that are in play, for everybody else. So I think it's a constant challenge, but certainly there are tools and tips that we can start thinking about in that space.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And it's kind of one of my little, pet hobbies is around the idea of turning, behavioural science, instead of always thinking about your customers or employees, it's actually turning it onto yourself, and be this government or private sector. And I think it's Jason Zweig, who's a author, and I think he actually sort of helped Daniel Kahneman write a lot of Thinking Fast and Slow. But he always just says, don't think of behavioural science as a lens, think of it as a mirror. And the most benefit will probably come from thinking about how you use it in your own decisions. And so this is actually one of the big things which I'm working on now, trying to get up sort of post Financial Services Royal Commission, is how do you have financial services companies not so much thinking about the customer decision making or products for customers, but just how do they make calls themselves, because clearly they failed pretty heavily over the last decade or so.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next one from Adam. So they've said, how small or competitive an industry is this specialised area both here and overseas? Does there already exist, or is there capability to extend practice beyond primarily government and banking to areas such as NGO, NFP?
Cool. Well, I'll have first stab at that one. So I think I've probably hinted a little bit about that it is just quite small. It's not hugely competitive. In government spaces, there's a little bit, but typically there's just not a huge number of firms, and this is the case globally. There's just not a large number of places. But on the scope of it, like that's absolutely on my mind is what are the future realms where we're going to take this. So it's my previous experience in government, both working in a term working with government. I've really turned the lens on the financial services the last couple of years because it's such a, the Financial Services Royal Commission, and just the fact that they have so many interactions with customers is so much value. But we've thought about what's the next big play. Health is something that's really on our minds, so particularly around decision making in health situations. Workplace safety is somewhere where we've also sort of dabbled around a bit. Have definitely talked internally to our not-for-profit practice area as to potential there, but it's actually pretty hard to find an area where you're not going to get some benefit from a better insight to how people make decisions, and the whole of consumer. Think about just any consumer industry. There's potential there, I think there's we're barely scratching the surface.
Yeah, I don't know if it's worth me commenting, but yeah, I would also agree on that part. I would say it's reasonably competitive to get into our team in government teams. That being said, I think often there's a sense that if you're not working in a behavioural insights team, you don't have the ability to apply this learning to what you're doing. And that is just so far from the truth. If you're interested in this area and you do some reading, I think there's elements that can be incredibly technical and nuanced and you have to be careful with, but there are some elements that you can pick up and start using. I mean, as Jason said, a lot of this work, you can make a big difference by suggesting that we plain English some document that we're sending out to people. There's a lot of insights that, and a lot of benefit that you could have just by suggesting that. So I guess don't necessarily think that you can't use this learning in jobs that don't have behavioural in somewhere in their title.
Awesome, thanks for that, guys. And Belle had a good question asking, how do you manage ethical risks in behavioural interventions?
Yeah, do you want me to start on this one, Jason?
Please do.
Yeah. Okay. This is a really common question and I love it because I think it's really important. So I guess the first thing is just to, oh good, and people are saying thank you, which means I think we're answering questions, which is good. Okay, so I guess the part of this is there's a few parts of ethics. So I'm going to deal with the easiest one first off, which is ethics in terms of running research trials. So you may be familiar that there are guidelines on how to do research. And I think one of the aspects, so that aspects in terms of just purely running research, our team has an ethics framework which is aligned to the NHMRC guideline on human research ethics, and depending on the risk level that is rated, the project is rated, it either goes to various different panels to assess the ethical risks of research. So that includes things like data governance, type of privacy, all of those components. So there's a kind of section around that. I can go into more detail if that is the area that I'm most interested in, but I suspect the actual aspect of ethics that you're mostly interested in is it okay to nudge people to do something? And I think the answer to that question comes a little bit in the counterfactual. And that is, there is no way not to nudge someone. If I send you a letter that's full of legalese, it will nudge you not to open that letter and not engage with it. If I write it in a really easy and user-friendly way, you're much more likely to engage with it. So that's kind of a simple way of thinking about it, but there is, again, a whole literature on this, and I think it's important to think about. Cass Sunstein has his Nudge for Good and a bunch of other things. I guess the final part of ethics that I kind of wanted to touch on is the social license to do these things. And I think partly we try to think about areas of place where it is better, we're sort of doing better outcomes for people and that they would be comfortable with that as well. So I think that's kind of a lens that it's important to bring to this kind of work. And I guess the kind of component of that is that government always has a role in some way of influencing behaviour. Traditionally, they've used three big levers. The first is kind of legislation and regulation, so we can make something against the law. That will change change the vast majority of people's behaviour if we make something against the law, huge behavioural lever. The second is to use financial incentives or incentives of other kinds. So we can give you a tax break for doing something that, works better for society. We can give you a financial penalty. And usually those things are applied to when there's sort of social harm. The final thing that we do is provide you with information. And normally when I'm talking about this, I just talk about the example of 5 serves of veg a day. And I ask people to let me know if they think they should be eating 5 serves of veg. Almost everyone put their hand up. And then I ask how many people ate 5 serves of veg today. And so for those who've got videos on, you can indicate whether or not you did in fact eat 5 serves of veg today. And probably about half of you, oh, Adam did, got a few people. But essentially about half people actually do. And so information is kind of a poor conduit to change behaviour. And so behavioural insights provides a lens across all those 3 things to make them better, but also allows government to use other tools that might influence behaviour that don't actually take away freedoms. So we're not making something against the law. Cool, that's my ethics wrap up. Jason?
Yeah, you've covered a lot. Let me just throw 2 other little ideas out there. One is just sort of a question which I've asked quite a lot, but never had to directly confront, is just simply, are there points where for a client we wouldn't be willing to work for them to achieve their goal? Would I be willing to help sort of some design more addictive pokies, or sell more ciggies? Like that's the extreme example, but taking something a little bit more subtle. So suppose that I was helping design the communications interactions with credit card customers, and instead of them going, we want to minimise the amount they pay, we said, how do we just maximise the amount of penalty fees we can extract from these people without them going broke, whatever. And thankfully I've never had to encounter that, but it's something I've thought about quite a bit around going, is there a line that ultimately I have to draw? And we see it all the time. Like behavioural science is used really effectively on a lot of, particularly say very addictive websites, or there's all sorts of dark arts used to try and get people to click and so on. We're willing to go there. That's something which I probably haven't answered, but I haven't really been pushed too close to that line. The other thing I think a lot about in the ethics space is around. I think quite sometimes, particularly in government space, we're a little bit quick sometimes to assume that people aren't doing the right thing, and don't spend enough time really going, okay, is there perhaps a real basis for their behaviour, or are they getting some benefit that we perhaps don't see? And I think a lot of that comes from we don't understand what people's objectives are. People have they don't have the same objectives as the government, and sometimes we just lack the knowledge that they do. So I'm always particularly loath to use the label irrational, which you see so often in this space, or biased, and really try and tackle problems with a degree of humility to try, really try and understand whether there is something going on that we should be changing behaviour for. Thankfully, a lot of my work, it's quite clear that something bad is going on. There's paying far more money for a financial product than they should. We can make it unambiguously better. But in some issues around, say, interventions to try and improve public health, and say around diet and some taxes on or barriers to certain foods, it's always clear to me that work is landing on the right side of the line. And as a final comment on that, just assuming people are wrong, you just look at the massive articles that were written back in late January, early February about how people are panicking and being irrational around this risk of the coronavirus, including for people like Cass Sunstein. And it was, as it turns out, a lot of people, just average punters, had better insight, or at least had a risk mechanism that was perhaps more attuned than those with the behavioural science qualifications.
Yeah, thank you guys for that answer. And I find it really interesting and really inspiring that, for both Jason and Kim, something that you've mentioned, and something like a couple of times is, I guess, the need to introduce humility into the work that you guys do. I think that's really inspiring to hear. And also, in terms of what you said as well, Kim, in terms of, I guess, answering the question about, I guess, ethical problems, I guess, it's always going to be counterfactual. So every way that a specific situation is going to be presented, it's not always going to be necessarily neutral. So I guess, it's just really interesting. I guess it depends on what side of the line you are in terms of, I guess, calling something good or bad. So it's really interesting there.
I think that the key part about that, and I think one thing is actually that testing is really good, and as much as we can test, we can I mean, there's always aspects of things that you can't test, and you can't test perverse outcomes, you know, in a number of different areas, but you can test some really key outcomes. And I think that's a really important way to guard against potential, you know, things not always working out. And certainly it is a really growing field, and it's really hard to always get it right. So I think the testing components of that really do help around some of those things.
Michelle, we did have 2 extra questions pop up in the chat.
Yep. So, Sanaz, do you wanted to go ahead with that?
Yeah, if we still have time to cover them. So the first one asked, how do you distinguish behavioural elements from fundamental drivers when it comes to capital markets, such as trading of a rational economic man versus trading behaviour with a biased mindset? How do you quantify them?
Yeah, this is opening up, 30, 40 years of academic debate as to whether you can actually do this and to what degree. So I don't have a answer to that, and probably can't. But I think people truly have. Something one of the funniest for me has been watching. There's a stock in the US that has the code Zoom, which is not Zoom, the company we're using right now, which I think has the code Zoom. But it's a good announcement for the Zoom video conferencing company. The Zoom stock ticker sort of let Zoom goes up in price because people are simply making an error as to which stock they should be buying. So you can always find in these markets little vignettes of people making a poor call. But that bigger question of going, is it a bubble? Are people being rational in chasing this bubble up? I probably don't have much to add to the long academic debates on that.
So we had one more after asking, what is your opinion on people's change of behaviour in response to the virus from a behavioural scientist perspective?
I might need to ask for more specifics on that in terms of, you know, I mean, there's so many different aspects of this, whether it's, you know, people purchasing different items at different times, you know, whether it's people choosing to stay home or not stay home. There's so many different components. I mean, realistically, I guess one of the reasons that, you know, certainly our team has been very busy in the last 2 months is because so many of the things that are key to handling the pandemic come down to behaviours. And interesting, I mean, it's an area where essentially individual decisions and individual behaviour has a massive social impact. So, you know, there's so many different components of that. Yeah, I might need a tiny, if you want to jump on and ask a little bit more specific, I can maybe be a tiny bit more specific, but there's so many different, I mean, maybe we can send you some links of the various different things that are being circulated. I don't know, Jason, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think a really interesting question here are what domain, like there's so many behavioural issues here. What are the domains where it's really useful? And there's been some interesting debates about this. So, you know, how do you get someone to wash their hands more? You know, that's you know, a great problem. You know, what communications could encourage this sort of behaviour? So that's on one end of the scale. So the micro behaviours you can possibly test. You know, you're not going to be able to maybe get into people's bathrooms, but there's probably ways of trying to work out which message is more effective. But then there's been, you know, the application almost at a societal level. So the UK initial sort of leaning towards the idea of herd immunity was based, at least in part, of an idea of behavioural fatigue. People would get tired of social distancing, and it's just a huge punt based on the science that was available to go, okay, people are going to get tired, so we're going to let this thing, you know, rip through the population. And at some point, they've clearly about a week into that strategy, suddenly looked at the numbers and went, oh my God, what have we done? And pulled back. And so there I think goes the sort of thing where you go, I think there is science, and there are papers that could lend some insight into that particular problem. But how much do you trust it? How willing are you to, you know, play a high strategy based on that science? And yeah, as it turns out, the UK wasn't willing to. So funnily enough, Sweden kind of, so maybe we'll get see what turns up there.
Awesome. We did have one last question again from Adam to do with the testing. So is it an economic format or psychology-based model?
So in our team, we have, so mostly we run randomized controlled trials, which is something, in the field, which is something common to both the economics profession and the psychology profession, and others too. So, the actual trial design and methodology is covered with both. But in our data team, although everyone has some level of data proficiency across the team, in terms of our kind of, core team, we have 2 psychologists and 2 econometricians, or 2 people with economics backgrounds. We have learnt that essentially we use different words for the same things, and that causes a lot of problems a lot of the time. And we have different ways of going about things. So there are constant debates between the 2 of us on how to do various different things. So what I would say is, I think people often assume that analysis or any kind of, way of doing it, it tends to be there's a black and white approach, that this is the right way to do it. As soon as you can dissuade yourself that there is a right way of doing things on that kind of, in terms of analysis in particular, the better you'll be, because there's so many different ways and there's so many different grey zones around this. So the best, I guess, method for that is making sure that you decide up front how you're going to analyse, how you're going to design your trial, all of those things, and that effectively gets locked in stone. And then after that, you run your analysis. That's certainly our approach, but it's so a combination of both.
It's kind of funny on the randomized controlled trial point. Like, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have really said that's the gold standard. That's what we're trying to do with everything. And I've sort of found that over the years, I've just become one, a little bit less trusting of randomized controlled trials, and secondly, a little bit more willing to, in fact, not willing, like just realize the absolute need to be trying all different ways of measurement and understanding what's going on. So really using the full qualitative suite of qualitative tools to develop hypotheses, recognizing, yes, there's randomized controlled trials, but there's a lot of other ways we can try and get insight into what's happening, particularly when a lot of our problems, what we're actually interested in is actually causation sometimes. Like what is not just a case of, did changing X cause Y, but why did it change? Because that's what gives us the power to apply it in other domains or work out how we're going to shift levers. And so when you start going there, you're introduced, you're pulling from an even broader toolkit. So when I'm doing work, one of the things I love about it, I guess, the breadth of the people I work with, and have access to in a place like PwC, we've got people who know machine learning and, all sorts of qualitative and quantitative methods, and I'm willing to pull on whatever I can just to try and learn more about what's happening.
That's super interesting, Jason. But yeah, so you mentioned that, in the last previous 5 years, randomized control kind of was the gold standard. But now you're seeing more value in terms of, I guess, the qualitative measures, and, asking why something, not only understanding the causation, but then understanding why something causes something. But I guess I'm curious, what do you see as the limitations, in randomized control? Do you feel like it's because, it's not really possible to get, the people that you're testing to be completely randomized, going to be different conditions that make that, not as, I guess, completely randomized? What do you think are the limitations which make you want to more qualitative? Sorry, it's a long-winded question.
No, it's not so much more qualitative, but a broader suite of tools. And there's a few things. So one is that we run a lot of randomized controlled trials in some areas, and you just you run enough trials, you turn up noise, it becomes hard to pull stuff apart. But I think for me, the bigger issue is actually around the size of the problems. And it's funny enough, this is actually a debate that happens in development economics as well as sort of in this space. And it's to attack a lot of the really big issues, the really interesting ones, you can't run a randomized controlled trial. You need a different toolkit. And so there's some critiques, say, of development economics, and so this is what the latest Nobel Prize was awarded in this area, but it's where they run a lot of small trials around deworming or giving chickens to people or running microfinance, whatever it would be, to see how they can improve the well-being of people in developing countries. And a lot of people will say that those trials, while they're important, they're valuable, they kind of explain less than 1% of the variation in the wealth between nations. And to really understand why they're a poor country and what can lead them to become a middle income or wealthier country, it doesn't, the policy solutions or whatever they are, if they are policy solutions, don't lie within these little things you can tweak and measure around control trial. They involve bigger ideas. And those bigger ideas require, you know, a different, broader tool set. They require you to try and understand mechanisms. They require you to accept sometimes that you're going to be using dirtier bias data without a nice control group. But that's just the reality of what you've got to tackle given the scale of the change that you're implementing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to the right tool for the job. And if you have the ability and the numbers to do a randomized control trial, you should start there. You know, but I think it's also about being open to various other different things. Certainly, we've done that in a number of our trials. I guess we try to start a randomized control trial as our first option and then work down from there. But I think it's also, I think it's also right around trying to pick the right tool for the job.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much for that, guys. I'm mindful of the time. It's, you know, approaching 7:10. Yeah, just wanted to say thank you so much to Jason and Kim for your time and for the insight that you've been able to share with us in regards to, you know, your career and also like the current state of behavioral economics and where you want to see it or hope to see it in the next 10 years. On behalf of everyone, I just wanted to say, a really sincere thank you and thank you so much for your time.